Little Fox.
Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 21. The Hatter Tries to Explain. The Dormouse came and sat next to Alice. As Alice began to grow, she thought she should leave the courtroom. But she was curious about the trial. So she decided to stay for as long as there was room for her.
I wish you wouldn't squeeze me like that,
The Dormouse complained to Alice.
I can hardly breathe.
The Griffin said.
I can't help it.
Alice said.
I'm growing. Well, you have no right to grow here,
The Dormouse said. His comment annoyed Alice.
Don't talk nonsense. You know that you're growing too,
She said.
Yes, but he doesn't do it all at once.
The Griffin said. The Dormouse and he got up and sat on the other side of the courtroom. Meanwhile, the Queen kept staring at the Hatter. She waved to one of the soldiers. "Bring me the list of the singers in the last concert," she said. When the Hatter heard this, he started to shake again.
Tell us your story right now,
The King said angrily.
or I'll have you put to death.
I'm a poor man, Your Majesty.
The Hatter spoke in a shaky voice.
I just sat down for tea, and then there was the twinkling of tea, and...
The twinkling of what?
The King asked.
It began with the tea.
The Hatter replied.
Of course. The word twinkling begins with a T. I'm not stupid.
The King was growing more impatient every moment.
Go on with your story.
After the tea twinkled, the March Hare said...
No, I didn't.
The March Hare interrupted.
You did!
The Hatter insisted.
I deny it.
The March Hare said.
He denies it.
The King said to the Hatter.
Leave out the March Hare and continue your story.
Alice looked at the jury box. All the jurors crossed out "I deny it" on their slates.
Those two guinea pigs have made a real mess of their slates,
She thought.
Well, then the Dormouse said...
The Hatter looked anxiously at the Dormouse, expecting him to deny everything too. But the Dormouse was fast asleep.
After that,
The Hatter said.
I had more bread and butter.
But what did the Dormouse say?
One guinea pig asked.
I really can't remember.
The Hatter said.
You must remember, or you'll be put to death.
The King said. The Hatter dropped his teacup and his bread and butter. He went down on one knee in front of the King.
I'm a poor man, Your Majesty.
He repeated.
You're a very poor speaker.
The King said.
Woohoo!
Here the second guinea pig cheered. A soldier immediately took it away.
If that's all you know, you may leave.
The King said to the Hatter. And here the other guinea pig cheered and was removed from the jury box.
I'd rather finish my tea first.
The Hatter said. He shot a quick look at the Queen, who was reading the list of singers.
You may go.
The King said. The Hatter rushed from the courtroom. "Just take his head off outside," the Queen said to one of the soldiers. But the Hatter was out of sight before the soldier got to the doors. Alice shook her head in disbelief.
The Hatter wasn't any help at all. At this rate, we'll never find out if the Knave of Hearts is guilty,
she thought.
Call the next witness,
The king said. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 22, A Surprise Witness. People sitting near the courtroom doors began to sneeze.
I know who the next witness is.
Alice said.
It must be the Duchess's cook.
Alice was correct. The cook entered the courtroom carrying her pepper shaker.
Tell us your story,
The king commanded.
No! I refuse!
The cook crossed her arms. The king didn't know what to do. He looked at the White Rabbit for advice.
Your Majesty, you must get this witness to tell her story.
The White Rabbit said.
The Knave of Hearts is accused of stealing the Queen's tart. This woman is a cook. She knows all about tarts.
Well, if I must, then I must.
The king said. Then he frowned at the cook for a long time. Finally, he said,
What are tarts made of?
Mostly pepper!
The cook said. Molasses, said a sleepy voice behind her. Seize that dormouse! The queen shrieked. Remove that dormouse from court! Off with his head! Off with his whiskers! For a few minutes, the whole courtroom was in confusion as the dormouse was removed. By the time everyone settled down again, the cook had disappeared.
Forget about the cook.
The king sounded relieved that he didn't have to deal with her anymore.
Really, my dear,
He whispered to the queen.
you must question the next witness. Dealing with all these people is making my head hurt.
No, it's your job, the queen said firmly. Alice watched the White Rabbit hold up his scroll of paper.
They really don't have any evidence against the Knave of Hearts yet.
She thought.
I wonder who the next witness will be.
Alice!
The White Rabbit called loudly. Alice jumped when she heard her name on the White Rabbit's scroll.
Here!
Alice leaped to her feet, forgetting how large she'd grown. She knocked over the jury box, and all the drawers tumbled out.
Oh, I'm so sorry!
Alice cried. Last week, she'd knocked over a bowl of goldfish. This accident reminded her of that. She felt as if she had to put the drawers back quickly, or they'd die. The king scowled at Alice.
This trial cannot go on until the jurors are back in their proper places.
Alice began working on it. But then she realized she'd put a lizard in upside down. She put the creature right side up.
Putting the jurors back is actually very silly.
Alice thought.
None of these creatures will be much help at this trial.
The jurors' slates were found and returned to them. They all began to write about the accident. All except the lizard, who stared at the ceiling.
What do you know about this tart business?
The king asked Alice.
Nothing.
Alice replied.
Nothing at all?
The king asked.
Nothing at all.
She repeated. For a few minutes, the jurors kept writing on their slates. The king wrote in a notebook. Suddenly, he called out,
Silence!
even though no one was talking. He read aloud from his notebook.
Rule 42. All people more than a mile high must leave the courtroom.
Everyone stared at Alice.
I'm not a mile high.
Yes, you are.
The king said. Almost 2 miles high, the queen added.
Well, I'm not leaving.
Alice said.
Besides, that's not a real rule. You just made it up.
It's the oldest rule in the book.
The king said.
Then it should be Rule 1.
Alice replied. The king shook with anger.
Ah! Jury, what is your verdict?
Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 23, A Mysterious Poem.
You can't ask the jury for a verdict.
The White Rabbit explained to the king.
There's more evidence to come.
The White Rabbit bent over and picked up a folded piece of paper.
See, this item has just been found on the floor.
The queen leaned forward to get a better look. What is it?
I haven't opened it yet.
The White Rabbit said.
Perhaps it's a letter written by the knave to somebody.
Unless it was written to nobody.
The king said.
Although that would be most unusual.
All the jurors nodded in agreement.
To whom is it addressed?
One juror asked.
It's not addressed to anyone.
The White Rabbit unfolded the paper as he spoke.
In fact, there's nothing written on the outside. Oh, it isn't a letter after all. It's a poem. Is it written in the prisoner's handwriting?
Another juror asked.
No, it's not, and I find that very strange.
The White Rabbit said.
The knave must have imitated someone else's handwriting.
The king said. The knave sighed.
I didn't write the poem, Your Majesty, and no one can prove that I did. Is there a name signed at the end of the poem?
After carefully reading the poem, the White Rabbit shook his head.
No, there's no name anywhere.
But the king was not satisfied. He spoke to the knave.
You didn't sign the poem, which only makes things worse. You were obviously up to some mischief. Otherwise, you would have signed your name like an honest man.
Everyone in the courtroom clapped wildly.
That's the first clever thing the king has said all day.
One juror said to another. Be quiet, the queen said, and everyone settled down. If the knave didn't sign the poem, that proves his guilt. So off with...
No, that doesn't prove anything at all.
Alice interrupted.
You don't even know what the poem is about.
Read the poem!
The king commanded the White Rabbit.
Where shall I begin, Your Majesty?
Begin at the beginning.
The king said.
And keep reading aloud until you get to the end.
And that is exactly what the White Rabbit did. There was dead silence in the courtroom as he read the poem.
This is the most ridiculous poem I've ever heard.
Alice thought.
It makes no sense at all.
But the king had another opinion.
This is the most important evidence we've heard all day.
He rubbed his hands together.
Now the jury must decide.
If any of them can explain it, I'll give them some money.
Alice said.
I don't think that poem means anything.
She had grown so large that she wasn't afraid to interrupt the king. The king ignored her.
Jury, what is your verdict?
He said for about the 20th time. No, no! The queen said. Tell us the prison sentence first, then the verdict!
That's absurd!
Alice said loudly.
No one gives the prison sentence first. What if the jury finds the knave not guilty? Then there wouldn't even be a sentence.
Be quiet! The queen said, turning purple with rage.
I won't!
Alice said. Off with her head! The queen shouted at the top of her lungs. Nobody moved.
Who cares what you think?
Alice said. By this time, she had grown back to her full size.
You're nothing but a pack of cards!
And at this, the whole pack rose into the air and flew at Alice. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 24, By the River. Alice shrieked with fear and anger as the pack of cards attacked her.
Stop that, you nasty things! Leave me alone! Leave me alone!
And then she woke up. Alice opened her eyes and found that she was lying by the river. Her head was in her older sister's lap. Charlotte was gently brushing away some leaves that had fallen onto Alice's face.
Oh, so it wasn't cards after all.
Alice said slowly. What are you talking about? Charlotte asked. She put down her book and stared at Alice. You had a nice long nap this afternoon.
I had the strangest dream.
Alice sat up.
First, I was right here with you. Then a rabbit ran by, checking his watch and worrying that he was late. I jumped up and followed him down his rabbit hole.
Charlotte laughed. A talking rabbit with a watch? Oh, Alice, you have a marvelous imagination.
The rabbit was wearing a colorful vest. And falling down the rabbit hole was only the beginning of my adventures.
Alice went on to tell Charlotte everything she could remember. She had met so many odd creatures. The mouse, the caterpillar, the Cheshire cat.
There was a queen who was always angry.
Alice said.
If anyone did the slightest thing wrong, she shouted, "Off with his head!" She even shouted, "Off with her head!" at me.
What did you do wrong? Charlotte asked.
I don't remember exactly.
Alice laughed.
But let me tell you more of what I do remember.
Alice finished her story. That was a very strange dream, Charlotte said. I'm glad you didn't really fall down that rabbit hole. But now it's time for you to run inside and have your tea. It's getting late, so off you go. Alice got up and ran off, thinking about her amazing dream all the way home. But Charlotte stayed by the river, watching the sunset and thinking of Alice's adventures. Soon she began to dream too. First, she dreamed about Alice as a little girl. Charlotte remembered Alice's voice and how she wore her hair. It was always falling in her eyes. Then she heard Alice's voice as it sounded today. After that, the riverbank began to come alive with creatures from Alice's dream. The long grass rustled at Charlotte's feet as the white rabbit rushed past. The mouse splashed through the pool of tears. Charlotte could hear the teacups rattling as the March Hare and his friends talked and talked. The Queen of Hearts kept shouting, "Off with his head!" The pig was sneezing on the Duchess's lap. And the Mock Turtle sighed and sobbed. Charlotte continued to doze by the river. "Alice's Wonderland feels so real," she thought. "But if I open my eyes, there will be an explanation for all these sounds." She knew that the wind was rustling the grass, not the White Rabbit. A bird was splashing in the river, not the mouse. The rattling teacups were actually sheep bells. The Mock Turtle's sighs and sobs were cattle mooing in the distance. All the other sounds came from a nearby farm. Finally, Charlotte dreamed about her little sister growing into an adult. She saw Alice as a grown woman who kept the loving heart of a child. Alice was gathering children around her and telling them many delightful stories. Some tales were about the happy summer days of her childhood, and others were about her adventures in Wonderland.